My wife asked to go to the special dinner with another man, and my answer was simple. I calmly said, go. Just don't come back expecting to find me here. She tried to laugh it off, thinking it was jealousy, the silly provocation of an insecure husband, but what she saw in my eyes wasn't anger or fear. It was the end. A hard, calm silence, the kind that carries an entire world about to collapse. That night, while she left for a date I didn't ask for details on and she made a point of not hiding, I packed my bags in silence. I packed a few clothes, documents, and left behind not only the walls that had surrounded us for years, but everything we'd once built together, or at least, everything I thought we had. I didn't leave a note, I didn't send a message. I just left. Because there was nothing left. What existed between us died even before the kiss with the other man. It died the moment she thought it acceptable to risk my love for curiosity, a game, a whim. I didn't scream, I didn't beg, I didn't ask why. Betrayal doesn't begin with the touch of another's skin. It begins the moment loyalty becomes choice, not instinct. When love ceases to be natural and must be decided every day. She crossed that line with the leap of indifference. She wanted to see how far she could go. And she did. But she wasn't waiting for me standing on the other side of the door, keys in hand and tearless eyes. I never thought I would become that man, but in that moment, I was. And then she came back. She opened the door with the same smile she'd left with. Expecting, perhaps, a scene, blatant jealousy, a desperate attempt to recapture what she'd tested. But she found emptiness. Silence. The closet half open, its hangers swinging slowly, like a subtle warning that what had been there was no more. He called my number, call ended. He searched through messages, nothing. He looked for traces, none. And it was there that she felt the absence for the first time. Not of the body, but of certainty. Because until that moment, she believed she could come and go, that love was eternal, that I would always be there, waiting, even after every doubt, every slip. But I was gone. Not just from the house. But from the idea of us two. And the cruelest part was what came next. The other man, the one she'd thrown everything away for, wasn't what she'd imagined. And not because he was a scoundrel or treated her badly. But because, in front of him, she realized she couldn't be who she was with me. She tried to be interesting, tried to shine. She tried to laugh lightly, to hide her nervousness, to hide the emptiness. She talked about travel, movies, music. He smiled politely, but his eyes seemed to look right through her, as if he already knew it was a mistake. And when dinner was over, there was no invitation for dessert, nor to continue the evening elsewhere. Just a kiss on the cheek and "it was good to see you." Cold. Clean. Sharp. She felt ridiculous. A one-night stand. And then it all began to sink in. Alone in the car, with her lipstick smeared and her cell phone silent, she looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror and realized she had lost. But not just a man. She lost her shelter. She lost the gaze that saw her even on days when she said nothing. She lost the respect of someone who always treated her as a priority, even when she forgot to reciprocate. She lost someone who would have done anything for her, except to deny himself. And that was what she tried that night, to see if I would deny myself out of jealousy. If I would chase her. If I would scream. And when she found no reaction, she understood too late, I still loved her, but I didn't love myself any less. Time passed. And she tried to move on. She tried to distract herself with social media, with friends, with new clothes, new versions of herself. But none of them worked. Because all of these versions still carried the weight of regret. And what she didn't expect was to see me again, months later, with a different sparkle in my eyes, with someone else by my side, someone who smiled with their eyes, who listened to me, who touched me as if recognizing value, not possession. It was in that reunion that she crumbled inside. She tried to joke, to be light-hearted, to say something, "You're okay, huh," with that slight irony, expecting me to reciprocate with the old humor she knew. But what she saw in me was politeness, and indifference. A respect without intimacy. A look that no longer recognized her as home. She called me to talk a few days later. She said she missed me, that it had all been crazy, that she'd never intended to lose me. She apologized with her eyes downcast and her voice trembling. I listened. Calmly. Like I'd listened so many times before without interrupting. And when she finished, I looked up and said what she never expected to hear, I forgive you. But forgiveness is not an invitation to start over. She cried. For the first real time. Not out of anger, not out of frustration. But out of regret. The purest, most sincere, and most cruel regret, the kind that comes when there's nothing left to do. And I believed in the tears. But I moved on. Because I had learned that love needs to be nurtured even when everything is fine, that loyalty can't be tested like a game. And that when respect is broken, it's not time that mends it, it's absence. Today, when she looks in the mirror, she no longer sees the woman who had it all. She sees someone who tried to play with the security of true love and discovered that love, when it tires, leaves quietly. It doesn't scream. It doesn't make a fuss. It doesn't warn. It just leaves. And the most curious thing of all is that, at that dinner, she didn't sleep with the other man. She didn't kiss him. She didn't touch him with desire. But even so, he lost everything. Because betrayal isn't in the act, it's in the intention. And in that look, in that choice, in that indifference to what we had, that's where everything died. What she doesn't know yet, and may discover too late, is what happened to me in the weeks that followed. What healed me. Who I met. And what made me never look back. Because even though she lost everything in one night, what I gained afterward was what she never had the courage to be with me, loyal without conditions. Respectful without needing tests. Love without needing to prove anything. But, what exactly happened between that door closing behind me, and the new smile that appeared on my face? That, she doesn't know yet. And that's where the story really begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize betrayal, we reject any form of disloyalty. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they reflect profound truths. Betrayal hurts, destroys homes, and leaves scars that time doesn't always erase. Our purpose is clear: show the price of wrong choices and the value of true love. Brace yourself. What's coming next is more than a story. It's a reality check. When Daniel met Laura, there was a calmness in her gaze that seemed to promise stability. She wasn't the kind of woman who arrived with a bang, and perhaps that was precisely what attracted him. There was a quiet sweetness about her, something between kindness and restraint, a demeanor that didn't seek attention, but nevertheless did. She was discreet, elegant in her gestures, and seemed to possess a lightness that contrasted with Daniel's always fast-paced world. He, on the other hand, was pragmatic, direct, the kind of man who didn't mince words. He came from a simple family, learned early to work for what he wanted, and valued anything that required effort. They met when they were still young, but not so young that they confused passion with love. They started slowly, over coffee and long conversations that never ended on the same topic. The connection came in their eyes, then in their ideas, and only then in their touch. Their relationship was built slowly, as if each step was carefully calculated to leave no room for doubt, no room for doubt. They married in a quiet autumn, with a small, intimate ceremony. Daniel wanted something simple, and Laura agreed. The wedding wasn't a lavish celebration, but rather a silent pact between two adults who believed in love as a daily decision. They chose a modest apartment, with furniture purchased piecemeal, as their savings allowed. Their life together, though full of adjustments, was serene. They shared chores, followed routines, and created small traditions. Every Friday night, they made pizza at home. On Sundays, they walked in the park and discussed old movies. It wasn't a movie life, but it was comfortable. Real. Laura took care of the details. She knew which spices Daniel preferred, what kind of music he listened to when he was tired, and he, in turn, quietly cared for her. He filled up her car without her asking, left notes on the bathroom mirror on random days, and listened attentively to even the most inconspicuous stories about her work routine. As the years passed, their responsibilities grew. Daniel began working longer hours, seeking to secure a solid future, while Laura began to excel in her field, earning promotions and recognition. The house grew quieter during the week, gatherings became rarer, and Sunday lunches became dependent on their schedules. But there was still laughter. There was still touch. There was still love. Or at least, that's what it seemed. The intimacy between them was made of knowing glances and comfortable silences, the kind only those who have lived together for years can cultivate. They understood each other's gestures, knew how to respect each other's space, and seemed to have avoided the trap of monotony. Even with the natural challenges of a long marriage, they maintained a balanced, mature relationship, free from outbursts and constant arguments. The world around them might change, but the structure they had built seemed unshakable. Daniel wasn't a man who demonstrated everything with words, but his actions were clear. He was always present for important moments, never missing birthdays or forgetting dates, and even when work was demanding, he found a way to show that she remained a priority. Laura, on the other hand, always knew how to make herself admirable. She was intelligent, articulate, the kind of woman who knew how to occupy space without invading others. But there was a restlessness about her, something that showed in the small silences between sentences, the long pauses in ordinary conversations, the glances out the window when no one was looking. It was as if something inside her craved more, even when everything around her seemed sufficient. This uneasiness grew slowly, almost imperceptibly. It began when the compliments became rarer, not out of disinterest, but out of habit. When their nights together became more about rest than conversation. When the two, without realizing it, began to move like two bodies in mechanical synchrony, each at their own rhythm, without colliding, but also without touching as much as before. It wasn't heartbreak. It was wear and tear. It was the accumulation of identical days, of the routine that slips through the cracks and gradually erases the once natural glow. Daniel didn't notice this slow erosion. For him, everything was as it should be. There was still laughter, there was still complicity. He didn't see the signs, or preferred not to. Laura, for her part, wondered silently if their love was enough to last another decade. Not out of guilt, but out of doubt. And doubts don't scream. They whisper. Still, the two remained together. They made plans for future trips, talked about perhaps buying a bigger house, even considered adopting a dog. None of these plans seemed urgent, and so they were put off. Everything was postponed in the name of time, which always seemed to slip away. Daniel, though tired from work, made an effort to arrive early on important days. Laura, even when immersed in her own uncertainties, allowed herself to laugh at his jokes, was moved by his simple gestures. And in those moments, everything seemed the same. As if the love, however hardened, was still there, firm, just waiting to be reawakened. Neither of them believed anything was wrong. Things just were. The way life often is when passion becomes routine, and love has to fight to remain a choice. The apartment where they lived was cozy, with large windows that let in the morning sunlight. Laura tended the plants on the balcony, speaking to them as if they were confidants, and Saturday breakfast was almost a ritual: pancakes, fresh juice, restrained laughter, and soft music playing in the background. It was there, in that simplicity, that they found each other. In the details. In the way he looked at her as she buttered his bread. In the way she straightened the collar of his shirt before leaving. Little things that seemed unimportant, but which, in their absence, would be missed. Because love, even in silence, lets you know when it's alive. And also when it begins to die. Laura wasn't unhappy. But she wasn't fulfilled either. And this created a void that was hard to name. There was no lack of respect, no lack of affection. But perhaps there was a lack of novelty. There was a lack of that look that says, "You still amaze me." Daniel, for his part, trusted so much in the strength of the bond he'd built that he never considered anything could be out of place. He believed that love meant caring, being present, ensuring security. And he did this with almost blind fidelity, but perhaps, for that very reason, he failed to see that sometimes love also requires emotional presence, words, enchantment. Still, what existed between them wasn't fragile. It was true love. But love also tires when it's not nurtured. Those around them admired them. They were seen as a stable, mature couple, an example of partnership. At family gatherings, they were always together, with matching smiles, intertwined hands, measured words. Friends commented on how well they understood each other, how they seemed to complete each other. But no one knew about the late nights when Laura would wake up and stare at the ceiling, feeling her chest tighten without knowing why. No one noticed Daniel's effort to keep everything running smoothly, believing that stability was synonymous with happiness. There were no fights. There were no shouting. Only silence. A silence that grew slowly, stretching between rooms, taking up space between kisses and plans, and that, over time, would become deafening. Their story seemed perfect from the outside. And perhaps, for that very reason, no one could have ever imagined what was about to happen. Because when everything seems to be in place, that's precisely when the cracks begin to appear, hidden in the folds of routine, in the pauses between laughs, in the glances that look away instead of facing. And there was something in Laura's eyes that was beginning to change. A different shine, a hesitation that hadn't existed before. But it was still too early to realize it. It was still time to believe that love, despite everything, would survive. What would come next, was still silent. And silence is sometimes the cruelest harbinger of a storm. In the months that followed, Laura and Daniel's routine remained seemingly unchanged, but beneath the tranquil surface, something subtle and dangerous was beginning to take root. The lack of overt conflict gave the relationship a false sense of stability, but an invisible distance was growing between them. Laura no longer looked forward to pancake Saturdays, their morning coffees became quieter, and her laughter, once so spontaneous, now sounded measured. Daniel noticed the signs, but interpreted them as reflections of the fatigue of daily life, the weight of work, the natural wear and tear of years spent together. He didn't know that, while he tried to keep the roof afloat, the foundations were slowly eroding. Laura began extending her time at work, accepting invitations to events she'd previously dismissed, and finding excuses to go out alone more often. She began taking better care of herself, but not out of vanity. It was as if she wanted to prove to herself that she was still desirable, still seen. Her vanity wasn't excessive, but it became deliberate. Lipsticks previously forgotten in the back of her drawer once again occupied space in her purse, and dresses saved for special occasions began to appear at routine lunches. Daniel noticed the changes, but interpreted them as positive signs, as a rebirth of his wife's self-esteem. He smiled when he saw her more alive, more active, never imagining that this new vitality had roots in a terrain unknown to him. The days went by, and Laura began to carry within herself a conflict she couldn't even name. There was guilt in every gesture, but there was also a growing unease. The solid, comfortable routine with Daniel, which had previously made her feel safe, now seemed to imprison rather than protect. It wasn't a lack of love. It was an internal noise that grew, fueled by secret messages exchanged, glances that lingered longer than they should, words spoken with ulterior motives amidst trivial conversations. This other man entered Laura's life slowly, almost by chance, appearing first as a more attentive coworker, then as someone with whom she shared confidences, and finally as a constant presence in her most private thoughts. She hadn't planned it. It wasn't a deliberate search. But the gap was there, a subtle need, an unspoken need, a longing to be seen in a way she hadn't experienced in a long time. With him, she felt renewed. He complimented her, listened attentively, looked at her as if she were still new. Soon, their encounters began to extend beyond work. First, hurried coffees. Then, dinners with poorly worded excuses. And finally, an invitation that would change everything. A special dinner, at a restaurant she had never been to with Daniel. Laura hesitated. She knew what that invitation represented. It was no longer about conversation, companionship, or connection. It was a line that, once crossed, there would be no going back. But her hesitation was short-lived. Inside her, there was a mixture of euphoria, fear, and a dangerous feeling of entitlement, as if, after years of effort and dedication, she had the right to experience something different, something all her own. When she casually mentioned to Daniel that she was going out to dinner with a friend, her voice was almost emotionless, as if she were talking about something trivial. He just looked. And it was in that look that she should have recoiled. But she didn't. Daniel didn't make a scene. He didn't shout, he didn't question her. He simply said she could go. And, with a calmness that disconcerted her, he added that if she did go, she shouldn't expect to find him upon her return. The sentence fell like a thin blade, not a shout, but sharp. Laura tried to laugh it off, downplay it, pretend it was just jealousy. But when she saw that his gaze held no irony, no fear, no pleading, she understood that the man before her wasn't fragile, not manipulable, and that what they were about to lose wouldn't be his fault. Still, she went. She chose her dress carefully, applied light makeup, and left without looking back. Inside the car, her heart pounded, not only with anticipation, but with something she refused to name. At the restaurant, the ambience was sophisticated, the music captivating, the wine he'd chosen. Everything seemed to fit perfectly. He smiled when he saw her, gave her a discreet compliment, and she smiled back nervously. She tried to act natural, but it was far from natural. During dinner, they talked about everything, laughed at small things, and shared confidences like two young lovers who hadn't yet grasped the limits of reality. But there was something strange about that night. The atmosphere, though seemingly perfect, seemed staged. Laura felt like she was trying to be someone he expected her to be, someone lighter, more carefree, more available. And as the night wore on, she began to realize that the woman he desired might not be her. There was an uncomfortable distance between the image she projected and who she really was. She felt uncomfortable in her own skin, as if she were betraying not only her husband, but herself. Still, she followed through. The dinner ended without promises. He paid the bill, walked her to her car, gave her a light kiss on the cheek, and said it had been good to see her again. The coldness of his words contrasted with the warmth of the previous atmosphere. There was no hotel invitation, no indecent proposal. Just a curt, good night, and a brief wave. Alone in the car, Laura looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. Her lipstick, once perfectly applied, now looked smudged. Her eyes, once vibrant, were dull. And then, for the first time in a long time, she cried. She cried not out of love, nor out of immediate regret. She cried because she had seen herself from the outside. And what she saw was someone trying to fill a void with a mistake. She walked home in silence. Each footstep sounded too loud on the living room floor. The lights were off, the sound of a hanger swinging in the closet, Daniel's glaring absence. He was no longer there. Not physically, not emotionally. It was only then that the full impact of the choice was revealed. The betrayal had been consummated not by the other man's touch, but by the decision to leave. By the silent contempt she displayed by valuing the adventure more than the history she had at home. And Daniel knew. He knew the moment she walked through the door. That night, the bed they'd shared for years remained empty. And Laura, lying on cold sheets, realized that what she'd done wasn't just a mistake. It was breaking something that can't be rebuilt. But what she didn't know yet, was that her mistake would carry far greater weight than she imagined. And what would come next, what she couldn't even begin to imagine, would change the course of her life forever. Laura spent the next few days in a state of torpor disguised as routine. She got up early, showered, and dressed as usual, but everything about her felt out of place. The silence of the house, which had once been a refuge, was now an abyss. There were no more footsteps in the hallway, nor Daniel's voice wishing her good morning with that confident timbre that always sounded like shelter. She didn't know where he was, didn't know if he would return, and, worse, didn't know if she truly wanted him back or just wanted his absence to stop hurting. The bed was made every night, but only one side was used. His side remained untouched, as if she expected that, at any moment, he would walk through that door and everything could go back to the way it was. But deep down, Laura already knew, there was no going back. He tried distractions, trying to occupy his mind with work, with the gym, with everyday commitments. But with each space filled by others, the emptiness seemed to scream even louder. He began writing messages and deleting them. He wanted to call, rehearsed what he would say, but no speech seemed worthy of a response. He began walking through the places they frequented together, as if hoping to run into him by chance, as if fate might offer a second chance in the middle of the street, in an unexpected gesture. But nothing happened. And time, which had previously flown so quickly, now dragged the minutes cruelly. Until one afternoon, as she was leaving the market carrying 2 bags she barely remembered why she'd bought, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but the voice on the other end made her body freeze for a moment. It was Daniel. He spoke with a painful calm, a firmness she hadn't recognized in him. He said he wanted to talk. That was it. No explanations, no beating around the bush. He arranged to meet for coffee in a remote neighborhood, a neutral place, no history. And he hung up before she could say anything. Laura arrived early. She sat by the window, fixed her hair 3 times, and ordered a coffee that cooled without her touching it. When Daniel entered, she barely recognized the man approaching. He was lighter, but not in body, in his eyes. There was a new glow, a quiet peace, almost painful to see. He sat across from her, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. It was she who tried to break the ice, asking how he was. He smiled slightly, without irony, and said he was fine. That he'd needed that time for himself. That he'd rethought many things. She tried to ask where he'd been, but he just looked away, as if it no longer mattered. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer the complicit silence of those who understand each other without words, but the final silence of those who no longer need to say anything. Laura started to apologize, saying she didn't know how she'd let things get this way, that she was confused, that she hadn't meant to hurt him, that she just wanted to understand what she was feeling. The words came out too quickly, as if by speeding up her speech she could get through the pain faster. But Daniel interrupted her, without raising his voice, just with a firm look. He told her she didn't need to explain herself. That he already knew everything. He knew about the dinner, the messages, the looks. That none of it surprised him anymore. And it was then that he took a deep breath and paused for a long time. He said the hardest part wasn't seeing her leave. The hardest part was realizing that, all that time, she'd stopped being herself. That she'd tried to transform herself into someone else to please someone who didn't know her, who didn't know what she liked, who didn't know the way she folded clothes or how she cried watching silly movies. And then he revealed it. She couldn't imagine it. She had no idea. But Daniel knew the man she'd been out with. He wasn't just a distant coworker, as she'd thought. It turned out that, years before, this man had been a close friend of Daniel's. They were practically brothers, raised together, with deep shared histories dating back to adolescence. They'd drifted apart after a nasty fight, sparked by family issues and an episode of disloyalty that Daniel had buried forever. Or at least he thought he had. Laura was shocked. She vaguely knew this part of the story, but she'd never connected the dots. She'd never known that this man was so intimately, personally involved in Daniel's past. And worst of all, the man she'd had dinner with knew exactly who she was. He knew she was Daniel's wife. He knew everything. And yet, he reached out. He encouraged her. He nurtured her. Daniel said he discovered this by chance, after seeing a photo of the dinner discreetly posted on social media. The profile was private, but someone close to him had shared it. And there was Laura, smiling at a man he knew better than he'd like. The feeling wasn't just of marital betrayal. It was twofold. A cut in two directions. Of someone who loses a woman and still sees the past resurface with sharp teeth. He didn't scream. He didn't confront the other man. He didn't make a fuss. He simply understood that this was the answer to all the questions he hadn't known he needed to ask. He said it was at that moment, upon seeing the photo, that he realized everything was over. That Laura wasn't just betraying him with another body, but with the naivete of someone who had been fooled twice, by a man who wanted revenge, and by herself, who thought she could touch the fire and get away with it. Laura cried. She cried like she hadn't cried since childhood. She tried to apologize, tried to explain that she didn't know, that she would never have done it if she had known, that it was all a mistake, that she still loved him. But he just smiled again. And said he believed her. That he believed she still loved him. But that love, sometimes, isn't enough to repair what's broken. He said he met someone in those months. He didn't go into details, didn't mention names. He simply said this person appeared when he wasn't expecting anything from anyone. And that, with her, he didn't need to prove himself, didn't need to be strong all the time, didn't need to fix what hadn't broken. He said this new woman looked at him as if he were exactly what he'd always wanted to be, enough. Laura lowered her eyes. The coffee was still intact. Her heart wasn't. For the first time, he felt the true weight of the choice. Not just for what he lost, but for what Daniel had found after her. There was no going back. And what hurt most was knowing he forgave her. Yes, he did. But he didn't want her back. They stood up. He put money on the table, thanked them for meeting him with a kindness that hurt more than any shout. And left. She stood there, alone, between cold cups and warm memories. But what she didn't yet know was that this wasn't the end of the story. There was still something to be discovered. Something that would change, once and for all, the way she viewed everything she'd experienced. Something that explained the cold gaze of the man she'd had dinner with. Something that made that betrayal even more bitter than it already was. Laura left the cafe as if carrying someone else's weight on her shoulders. The sun was still high, but everything around her seemed gray. The city continued with its sounds, its cars, its rush, but inside her, everything was slow, muffled, as if time had surrendered to pain. She walked aimlessly, crossing streets she hadn't even noticed, looking at shop windows without seeing anything, feeling an emptiness that seemed to grow with each step. The revelation she'd received in that cafe wasn't just about a name, about an unexpected connection between two men. It was about how much she'd ignored signs, how naive, or worse, indifferent, she'd been. She knew she'd made a mistake, but now the mistake had reached proportions she'd never imagined. It wasn't just about what she'd done. It was about who she'd allowed into her life, about how she'd opened the door to someone who silently wanted to destroy everything she'd built. In the days that followed, Laura tried to comprehend the depth of that plot. She replayed every conversation, every encounter, every word spoken by that man. She began to piece together pieces that, once loose, now fit together with disturbing precision. The questions came flooding in. Did he know who she was from the start? Did he plan it all? Did he approach her out of revenge? Did he show up just to wreak havoc? And the answer to each question hurt more than the last, because everything pointed to a yes. Then, late one afternoon, she received a message that made her freeze. It was from him. Short, direct. Can we talk? Her hand trembled as she held the phone. She considered deleting it, ignoring it, pretending she hadn't read it. But curiosity and the need to understand drove her. She arranged to meet in a discreet place, far from any memory. She wanted answers. And, perhaps, some explanation that would make it less cruel, less calculated. The chosen place was a small, dark bar with tables spaced apart. She arrived first, as usual, and sat in the back, trying to hide her nervousness. When he arrived, he was different. The air of lightness and seduction had given way to something more serious, colder. He sat down without greeting her affectionately, without smiling. It was as if they both knew there was no room for politeness. Laura was direct. She asked if he'd known who she was from the beginning. He hesitated for a moment, then confirmed it. He said he'd figured it out in the first few days, that her last name had made him connect the dots, and that curiosity led him to confirm. She asked why. And his answer was curt. He said it wasn't planned, but that when he realized it, he saw an opportunity. Not to hurt Daniel, he claimed he'd gotten over that. But to prove to himself that he could still have whatever he wanted. That he could touch what once belonged to someone else. The words cut like a blade. Laura felt her face burn. He continued, as if each sentence were a sharp blow, "You were the symbol of everything he had and I didn't. I just wanted to see if he still loved you enough to care." She stood up, indignant, but he asked her to sit down. He told her what he would say next was important. He revealed that he had never wanted anything to do with her. That dinner had been a test, for her, for Daniel, for himself. That he knew she was vulnerable, knew her looks, knew her uneasiness. And that he had used that, yes. But what destroyed her most was what came next. He said that after dinner, he lost interest. That seeing her trying to be someone else, trying to be charming, trying to fit into a mold that wasn't hers, he felt sorry for her. That she had devalued herself there, at that restaurant table. That, contrary to what she thought, he never saw anything truly interesting in her. That the fascination ended the moment he realized she would trade everything for a compliment. Laura interrupted him, angry, ashamed, with a mix of emotions she couldn't even name. She said he was cruel, that he took advantage of her in a fragile moment, that he played with her feelings as if they were chips in a cheap game. But he just stared at her, remorseless. She said that, unlike her, he never promised anything. Never said he loved her. Never offered her a future. That it was she who destroyed his own home, not him. She left with her heart broken. The pain was so deep I could barely breathe. She didn't cry. Not then. Not there. But when she got home, she curled up on the bathroom floor and let her entire body tremble. It was as if she stood in front of a mirror and could no longer recognize the woman she saw. It wasn't just regret. It was shame. Guilt. The feeling of having been foolish, of having been used, of having destroyed everything for nothing. In the following days, Laura avoided everything and everyone. She disappeared from social media, turned off her phone, and declined invitations. He isolated himself from the world like someone who needs to silently pick up the pieces. But the world didn't stop. And what hurt her most was knowing that, on the other side of town, Daniel was fine. Not just fine, he was different. Renewed. He had moved on with a dignity she couldn't sustain. She found out from a friend that he was dating someone. That he appeared smiling, more relaxed, more confident. That he frequented the same places, but with another woman. A woman no one knew, but who seemed to fit into him like an extension of his calm. She was beautiful, yes. But she was something more. She had a whole look. And the cruelest thing of all was knowing that this woman admired him. That he had been rediscovered by someone who saw in him everything Laura had forgotten to see. She decided to seek him out once more. Not to win him back. Not to apologize. But to say she was sorry. She wanted to close that cycle with some dignity. He agreed to meet her, this time in a park. An open, neutral place. When she arrived, he was already there, sitting on the bench, with a calm, serene expression. She sat, and for a while, neither of them said anything. Then she began. She said she knew there was no going back. That she understood everything now. That what she had done wasn't just cheating, it was wasting it. That she saw in him something so right, so secure, that she forgot that love needs to be nurtured. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but that she needed to say she was sorry. Truly. Daniel listened in silence. Then he took a deep breath and spoke with a sweetness she hadn't expected. He said he did forgive her. That he held no grudge. That time had taught him that some people don't stay, not because they don't love, but because they don't know how. He said he didn't wish her harm. He truly hoped she would rediscover her worth. But among everything he had learned in the past few months, there was one lesson he would never forget: love doesn't survive when it becomes a test. And then he told her that the man she'd gone out with had told him everything days before she knew. That they'd met by chance at a professional event and that, in a gesture he hadn't expected, the man confessed everything. Not out of regret, but out of pride. As if to prove he still had power. And Daniel listened. And as he listened, he felt his heart break free. Because then he understood that none of this was about him. It was about other people's choices. He said goodbye with a short hug. There was no hard feelings. Just a silent goodbye. Laura sat for a while, looking up at the sky. She knew that from then on, everything would change. Not just for him, but for her. Because now she understood that losing a true love wasn't the punishment. It was the consequence. And what remained, in the end, was to live with the absence of someone she herself had pushed away. And accept that forgiveness isn't an invitation to start over. It's just a chance to move on, alone. Laura left the park slowly, as if her body needed time to accept what her mind already understood. There was nothing more to say between her and Daniel. The conversation, though serene, had definitively concluded a story she never imagined would end like this. For years, she believed that, no matter what happened, he would be there. That, even if their paths diverged for a time, there would always be a bridge between them, something invisible and unbreakable. But now she understood that trust, once destroyed, cannot be rebuilt with regret. That time can heal wounds, but it cannot undo scars. And that the presence of forgiveness does not mean an invitation to return. In the days that followed, Laura began to rethink her entire life. There was no return to normality, and she no longer tried to simulate a routine that had been shattered. The apartment, once a refuge, now felt cramped, uncomfortable, filled with memories that brought no comfort, only pangs of absence. The objects in the house seemed to regard her with silent judgment. His favorite cup still sat on the highest shelf, where she could never reach it without help. The plants were dying one by one, as if realizing that care had departed with those who knew how to cultivate love. At the same time, Daniel's face wouldn't leave her memory. Not the one from when they were happy, but the one she'd seen in the park, a man at peace. A whole man. His expression had changed. He no longer carried the hurt, and that was what hurt the most. It was as if she no longer mattered. And deep down, she really didn't. She'd ceased to be a part of his life when she chose to act without considering the consequences. She then began to question who she was, not as a woman betrayed by her own illusion, but as someone who, at some point, chose to hurt those she loved out of impulse, need, or vanity. The moral dilemma was now silent and cruel: how to move forward with a story in which she herself was the villain. And what to do with regret when there is no one left to ask for explanations, when there is no longer an audience for an apology. Life went on. The world doesn't stop for those who suffer. Laura began to see this more clearly than ever. People continued to come and go, cars crowded the streets, couples in cafes still laughed, as if the universe didn't know she had failed irreparably. She slowly returned to work, but without the same sparkle as before. She talked less, avoided meetings, and declined invitations. It wasn't about social embarrassment, but about the emptiness of no longer having a story to tell. On one of those cloudy days, when her heart felt lighter but her soul still bled silently, Laura received an unexpected message. It was from a woman she barely knew, someone she'd heard about once or twice through a mutual friend. The message was cordial, almost shy. It said she'd like to talk to her, that she felt it was important to clarify something. Laura, driven by a restlessness she couldn't explain, accepted the invitation. They met at a small cafe, far from the places that had once been important to Laura. When they met, the woman, named Helena, seemed more nervous than she was. The conversation started slowly, but Helena soon became direct. He told her he knew Daniel. That they'd been together for a few months. That they'd met casually, in a bookstore, and that the connection was immediate. Laura listened in silence. As much as I knew he'd moved on, it was different to see it take shape, form, and voice. But Helena hadn't asked for that meeting just for that. She said that Daniel, from the beginning, had been honest. He told her everything about what he'd experienced with Laura. Not with resentment, but with the look of someone who had learned from the pain. She said he never treated her as a replacement, but as a choice. That, with her, he rediscovered the peace he'd lost. She also said he knew who Laura was and that he always felt he needed to find her somehow. Laura asked why. And then Helena responded with something that completely disarmed her. She said that, even though she loved Daniel, even though she was happy with him, she always felt there was a part of him still attached to an unfinished story. That it wasn't love anymore, but something deep. A bond that couldn't be undone so easily. And that's why she wanted to meet Laura. Not out of jealousy, nor insecurity. But because she wanted to look into the eyes of the one who once made Daniel dream of forever, and understand how that forever was destroyed. The two talked for hours. It wasn't an argument, nor an accusation. It was a rare encounter between two women connected by the same story, but with distinct roles. Laura, for the first time, saw the impact of her own choices from a different perspective. She understood that it wasn't just she and Daniel who had suffered. There was a trail that extended beyond them. After this encounter, Laura began to walk differently. No longer as someone hoping for redemption, but as someone who needed to build a new path from her own ruin. She began therapy, returned to old habits she had abandoned, and reconnected with people she had previously pushed away. But none of this was to win Daniel back. It was for her. Because she finally understood that, to move forward, she needed to find herself again. The moral dilemma was now clearer. It wasn't just about having betrayed someone. It was about having allowed a lack of communication, complacency, and vanity to speak louder than love. Laura and Daniel's story wasn't destroyed by a single act, but by small, accumulated negligences over time, which exploded when least expected. And as she struggled to find her balance amid the ashes, a letter arrived. Handwritten, in a plain envelope, with no return address. He recognized the handwriting the moment he saw it. It was from Daniel. The content was brief but sharp. He said he hoped she was well, that he wished her a peaceful life, and that, although their story had ended painfully, he didn't regret living each day by her side. Because, however bitter the end, the beginning had been real. And there, with teary eyes and the paper in her hands, Laura understood that some stories don't need to be eternal to be important. Some people come to teach, others to awaken. And some, like Daniel, pass through our lives like a love that is unforgettable, not because it remains, but because it transforms us. There was still a path to be walked, and she would follow it. Not to erase what had been done, but to ensure she would never make the same mistakes. And for the first time, she no longer felt only guilt. She felt responsibility. And that was the seed of a new beginning. The morning after reading the letter, Laura woke before sunrise. For the first time in months, her awakening wasn't accompanied by anguish or that numbing feeling of emptiness. There was something different inside her, a quiet mix of acceptance and purpose. She walked to the kitchen, still barefoot, lit the stove to make coffee, and felt the scent slowly rise, filling the room with a familiarity that seemed long lost. She picked up the mug that used to be Daniel's, not as a way of cherishing longing, but as a symbolic reminder of what had once been important. She set the coffee on the table, sat down, and remained there for a few minutes, watching the daylight streaming through the window, as if that simple act of existence were, in itself, an achievement. A few weeks after her last meeting with Helena, Laura's life was beginning to find a new rhythm. It wasn't peace yet, but it wasn't an internal war either. The feeling that everything had broken irreversibly still lingered within her, but it didn't hurt as sharply. It was a pain transformed into maturity, into discernment. She began attending a therapeutic writing group, a place where others shared pain, loss, and rebirth in words. At first, she listened more than she spoke, but gradually she began to open up space for her own story, without embellishments, without trying to justify what happened. Simply letting the truth find its own tone. At one of these meetings, an older woman with a sweet voice and lively eyes told her after hearing one of her stories, "Sometimes, losing someone is the only way to find yourself." Laura kept that phrase hammering in her mind for days. She began writing more, recording thoughts she'd previously kept to herself. The words began to restore something she thought she'd lost: identity. Over time, she realized she no longer needed to tell the story of her marriage as a veiled apology, but as a journey that, however derailed, had real, profound moments that, despite everything, deserved to be respected. One Friday afternoon, while reviewing a text she'd written about forgiveness, she received an unexpected call. It was Daniel's mother. At first, she hesitated to answer, but something inside her urged her to do so. The voice on the other end was soft, gentle, and, to her surprise, warm. "Laura, I thought long and hard before calling. I know things have changed, but you were part of our family for a long time, and I'd like to see you." The invitation came without judgment or promises. It was simply a sincere gesture from someone who wanted to understand what was left of that story. Laura accepted. She knew she needed this, more than she realized. The meeting took place in the house where so many Sunday lunches had been shared. Upon arrival, everything seemed the same, yet also completely different. The flowers in the garden were still there, the aroma of home-cooked food was in the air, the old portraits on the walls. But the silence that filled the space said so much more. They sat at the table with tea, and the conversation began with memories. The mother-in-law remembered small details: the day Laura forgot the oven was on, the burnt cake that became a joke, the birthday they improvised with pizza and music on their cell phones. They laughed. They cried. They spoke of Daniel as if they were talking about a son who had grown up, gone off into the world, and become another. Laura, her voice breaking, confessed how much she regretted it, but her mother-in-law interrupted her with a calm gesture. "Daughter, who hasn't lost themselves trying to find themselves? I'm not here to judge you. I'm here because, despite everything, I know who you are. And that doesn't go away." The words fell on Laura like a bomb. Not out of relief, but because it was the first time since the breakup that someone had seen her as a complex human being, capable of making mistakes, but also of changing. On the way out, before saying goodbye, Daniel's mother said something that would stay with Laura forever: "Life doesn't always give us second chances with others. But it always gives us ourselves. Just don't waste this one." Laura drove home in silence, driving the same streets she'd walked countless times before, but now everything had a different meaning. It wasn't about Daniel anymore, nor the betrayal, nor the other man. It was about her. About what could still be. About the woman who was beginning to emerge from the chaos. Her writing intensified. Laura began writing every day, and her texts ceased to be rants and became almost chronicles of the soul. She began to be invited to read at gatherings, then to publish in small literary spaces. She received a proposal to organize a book with stories from women who, like her, had lost themselves to meet others' expectations, and who were in the process of rebuilding themselves. For the first time in a long time, she felt she was contributing to something that wasn't just about pain, but about what might come after it. One day, leaving a lecture on vulnerability and forgiveness, Laura ran into Helena outside. The reunion wasn't planned, but it wasn't awkward either. They walked together to the parking lot and talked like two women who, despite sharing a history with the same man, had learned to respect their pain and triumphs. Helena said Daniel was fine, that the relationship was still strong, but that he still bore its scars, like anyone. He no longer speaks of the past with bitterness, only with gratitude for what he learned. Laura smiled, not with envy or pain, but with understanding. She knew their love was over, but there was no need to end it with resentment. Back at her apartment, she sat at the table with her old coffee mug and began to write. The words flowed with a clarity she had never imagined. She no longer wrote to erase what had been done, but to record what she had learned. She wrote about the ego, about the silences that kill, about the lack of dialogue that turns love into ruin, about the danger of thinking the other will always be there, waiting. And she also wrote about forgiveness, not as a favor to be asked, but as a gift to oneself so that one can continue living. The downward spiral of her own life didn't come with easy rewards, miraculous returns, or predictable happy endings. It came with lucidity, with maturity, with the courage to look in the mirror and recognize, without masks, who she was and who she could still be. Daniel was in another life. She, in another chapter. But what remained of their story wasn't a failure. It was a lesson. And deep down, Laura knew that the true weight of a wrong choice lies not in the punishment, but in the conscience. Now, as he walked through the city streets, he no longer avoided the places where they were. He passed them with respect, not pain. He no longer felt the need to explain his story to others. The truth was that some mistakes can't be fixed, only understood. And with this understanding, Laura found peace. Not because she had regained what she lost, but because she had discovered that sometimes, the greatest new beginning lies in accepting the end. She knew Daniel's forgiveness was genuine, but that nothing in that gesture was an invitation. And this clarity, which at first felt like punishment, was now liberation. Because while she had been trapped in the desire to turn back, he had already moved on. And now, finally, she was moving on too, not in the same direction, but with the same dignity. And that, in the end, was all that remained. And it was enough. Years have passed since Laura and Daniel last saw each other. There were no unexpected encounters, no messages exchanged in lonely early mornings. There were no relapses, no attempts at reconciliation, no exchanged glances in supermarket aisles. Their past remained exactly where it should have been, closed. And yet, alive, like a chapter read and reread until the pages turned yellow and the pain dissolved into learning. Life followed different paths for them, but neither remained inert to what they experienced. The pain they both faced left deep scars, but also shaped more complete versions of who they once were. Neither emerged unscathed, but both survived. And, more than that, they evolved. Daniel, after a period of quiet retreat and reconstruction, forged a new relationship with Helena. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect. But it was genuine. He learned to love again, without carrying ghosts, without waiting for the new woman to correct the flaws of the old one. He understood that mature love isn't built on idealization, but on real presence, on affection that doesn't need testing. Helena brought lightness to his life. She wasn't a replacement, but rather a new path, a new story with room to grow without comparison. They moved to a simple house in a quiet neighborhood, cultivated new habits, created new traditions. Little by little, Daniel smiled again as before, but with a new awareness. He was a man who had been betrayed but refused to become cynical. He chose not to carry the weight of resentment, but the lightness of someone who survived without losing the ability to love. Laura, on the other hand, had a more solitary process. Her reconstruction wasn't driven by a new relationship, but by a profound internal journey. Her writings gained strength and depth, and became a self-published book. The work was received with surprise by those who only knew Laura superficially. She spoke about loss, self-sabotage, loyalty, and rebuilding with a brutal honesty that touched people in places they didn't even know hurt. She participated in events, gave interviews, and wherever she spoke, she was listened to attentively, not for the tragedy she experienced, but for the lucidity with which she exposed her flaws. She became an admired woman not for having done things right, but for having the courage to face her mistakes head-on. She didn't get into a relationship again for a long time. And when she did, it was with someone she met in a book group years later. He was a calm, sensitive man who knew how to respect her space, unhurried, and unpressured. With him, Laura learned that she didn't need to be extraordinary to deserve love, just whole. And this time, she was. The man Laura had been involved with in the past, the one who had started it all with hidden intentions, had his fate sealed by his own vanity. He continued to move through social circles with his superficial charisma, but the mask slipped over time. The manipulation that had previously gone unnoticed began to be noticed, his intentions becoming all too obvious. He tried new relationships, but none of them worked. The trust of others faded, and little by little, he became alone. Not because of the punishment of others, but because of the very nature of his choices. He came to be remembered as someone who could have been so much more, but chose the game over the truth. And in the end, the game swallowed him. The circle closed when, by chance, a reader of Laura's book approached her at an event and said that her story had saved her from destroying her own marriage. She recounted, with tears in her eyes, that she saw herself in the story, that she recognized the signs, and that, instead of seeking in others what she lacked within herself, she decided to face her own emptiness. Laura listened in silence, felt her eyes well up, and there, in that moment, she understood that the pain she felt had not been in vain. That becoming a mirror for the pain of others was also a form of redemption. Not through absolution, but through responsibility. Over time, Daniel and Laura became nothing more than a distant memory. There was no need to stay in touch, no hidden desire to get back together. There was a silent mutual respect, made up of everything they'd experienced and everything they'd chosen not to experience anymore. When they crossed names in conversations with mutual friends, the feeling was no longer of loss, but of peace. Each moved on. And that's how it had to be. One day, sitting on the porch of their house, Daniel and Helena watched the sunset, barefoot and with a cup of tea in their hands. He commented, almost as if talking to himself, that the hardest part wasn't forgiving Laura, but forgiving himself for letting the story get to where it did. Helena, with mature and calm affection, replied that we all have chapters we'd like to write differently, but what matters is how we end the book. Daniel simply smiled, watching the sky turn orange, and felt a rare feeling within himself, completeness. Laura, on a rainy night, finished revising the manuscript for her second book. It was lighter, more hopeful. She no longer spoke only of loss, but of reconnecting with herself. She looked out the window, saw the raindrops falling on the glass, and thought about how everything could have been different. But not with regret. With gratitude. Because now she knew. She knew the price of choices, the weight of absences, and the value of true presences. She knew that love is not measured by time, but by how much one is able to preserve it even on difficult days. And she knew, above all, that betrayal is not just an act. It is the sum of small omissions, of silences that scream, of absences that hurt. This story ends without a perfect ending, but with a fair one. Each received what they built with their actions. Daniel found peace. Laura found purpose. And the man who played with what was sacred discovered, too late, that not everything in life is recoverable. Some mistakes leave scars, others leave lessons. And there are those who leave only loneliness as company. If you've made it this far, with a heavy heart or tears in your eyes, share in the comments what you felt after listening to this story. What touched you most? Have you ever experienced something similar? Your opinion is very important to us. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now. Every week we have intense, real, and moving stories like this one, to make you reflect on what really matters. This story is living proof that betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship. It destroys respect, the gaze, the memory of love. It slowly erodes the essence of what was built with affection and intention. And those who betray don't always lose immediately. But over time, life takes its toll. Because love without loyalty is a castle built on sand. It may seem beautiful for a while, but all it takes is a real wind to crumble it. The channel makes it clear once again, we do not support, normalize, or romanticize any type of betrayal. Our commitment is to truth, reflection, and the appreciation of what truly builds, respect, dialogue, and emotional commitment. Until the next story. And remember, those who love, care. Those who care, do not cheat.